I'm going to be a bit of a new face. I'm Abigail, and I'm 19 years old, and today I'm going to be talking to you about kind of an interesting / different topic when it comes to faith in Christianity, which is the topic of music. Something that's not spoken about very much, but I think it's very relevant to talk about it. And you might be thinking, hang on, why? And that would be a very fair question to ask. However, I think ultimately, just as a starting point, music is a part of our faith and a part of Christianity everywhere that we go. You know, there are Christian radio stations, there are Christian festivals and musicians and artists and all of this kind of stuff. And even beyond that, you know, we have music in our services all of the time, whether it be hymns or more modern worship music. It's a part of our faith and it's a part of the life of a Christian, whether in the modern day or in history. And so as it's already kind of embedded in our experience and in the Christian experience, it's something which I at least think is relevant to talk about and it's relevant to try to understand it. However, what kind of propels it from being not only relevant but to being significant in our faith is how music is able to express, how it is able to express beyond that which language can. And in order to sort of properly explain what I mean by that, I'm going to start answering a question with another question, which is, how many people, obviously you don't have to actually answer this, how many people have watched a musical or like musicals? It doesn't really matter whether you like them or not, but I would say that pretty much everybody has at least seen some of a musical, or they have some knowledge of how a musical works, that they know what they are. They're a film or a play that contains music, that contains musical expression as well as verbal and as well as non-verbal, general non-verbal expression. And the thing is that anybody who has seen a musical, as well as scholars of film and scholars of theatre, will comment that and will recognise that in a musical, the role of music is that when the emotional gravity of a situation gets to its height, music is used in order to display and convey those emotions, to display and convey those difficult situations when ultimately words alone would fail to. Words alone wouldn't manage to quite capture the exact essence that is required for that scene. And so this kind of introduces me to the title of what I'm talking about today, which is that when words fail, music succeeds. And so you might be thinking now, like, that's great and everything, but I don't really care about musicals. I don't honestly care about music that much. And so why are you talking about music and musicals and not Jesus? That's a fair point. However, I think actually that musical expression is not only important but vital to our faith. And I'm hopefully going to be able to explain to you why. Because the thing is, as I was just speaking about with the whole thing with musicals and how music is able to express that which words cannot, and it's able to go beyond that, I want to draw your attention to actually, how many times do you think you've been able to define, describe, explain God accurately? Do you think anybody has been able to? I mean, the closest that we get as a biblical definition of God and a biblical explanation of God is what God says in Exodus, which is, I am that I am who I am. And so I think that kind of summarizes quite aptly the inability for human language to give a proper explanation of God, to the point where God himself is saying, I am that I am. It cannot be described, it cannot be explained. And even in 1 Timothy 16, there is the passage, God dwells in unapproachable light, whom no man has ever seen or can see. So it's clear that God is someone who we can't really understand in purely verbal terms. We cannot understand in purely linguistic, in pure language. And therefore, I think it's necessary that we have these other mediums of expression. And obviously, Christian art has been utilised greatly throughout time, but also so has music. We can see throughout the Bible, you know, you have the Book of Psalms, which is essentially just a really old hymn book, as well as several hymns scattered throughout the New Testament and throughout the Old Testament, throughout the entirety of the Bible. It's always been a part of our faith. It's just something that we have failed oftentimes to really talk about or think about why it's significant or why it's necessary. However, ultimately, the thing is that if we have this God which cannot be described, which cannot be explained, we have this beautiful gift of music, which goes beyond explanation itself. You know, when you listen to a piece of music, you feel it ultimately, rather than being able to describe it necessarily, or being able to even understand it. It's something that you feel in the heart. And so, in that way, music is able to communicate to us things which cannot be explained. And this is why, ultimately, I think that musical expression is important and vital to faith. So kind of continuing on from that, I want to talk about how music then both connects to and reflects the Spirit. When I speak about the Spirit, of course, I mean the Holy Spirit. There's this section in 1 Samuel, around 1 Samuel 16, 14 to 17, but it kind of goes on throughout the entirety of that book, which is, there is King Saul, and King Saul is afflicted by evil spirits, and they kind of come and go, but ultimately he has this affliction with evil spirits. And in 14 to 17 of that chapter, Saul says to his servants that he needs a godly man who is able to play the lyre to come and perform to him, and that would rid him of the evil spirits. Now that's a lot of faith to have in someone's ability to play the lyre. Like, goodness me, I would feel very under pressure in that performance. But they find a person, and that person is David, who hopefully you will recognize that name. King David, Star of David. It's that one. It's that guy. And he comes along, and he's a godly man, and he plays the lyre. And it works just as they had expected. Saul is rid of his evil spirits, and this actually becomes a kind of ongoing practice, that when Saul is afflicted by these evil spirits, David will come along and he'll play the lyre, and it will heal him of those evil spirits. So biblically speaking, we can already see that music connects to the Spirit. And if music connects to the Spirit, then it means that it must have this full range of emotional expression, because the Spirit doesn't only navigate in joy, and it doesn't only navigate in pain. It transcends all of human emotion, and it is able to communicate and to function within all of human emotion and expression. And it's both in the means and in the meaning of the expression. So that means that as well as it communicating across all of those emotions, it means that it can communicate in all genres of music, as much as some people might not want it to be able to. Some people really, really like their traditional hymns, some people really, really like their electric guitars, but truth be told, either can be used by the Spirit to communicate, and so can many, many other forms of music which the church barely touches, which is quite exciting, I think. But as well, I think what is interesting is that music is also able to reflect the Spirit. And so this is what's good for if you're not a musical person yourself, then it means that this is still relevant to you, don't worry. Because it means that by understanding music, we are able to actually get a further understanding of the Spirit. And a kind of way of me getting at that is sort of what I spoke about before, how music cannot be explained, however it touches you, it makes you feel, it can change you even. And I think that is actually very, very similar to how we talk about the Spirit, The Spirit often, when we talk about it, we say, like, oh yes, and it's this kind of overwhelming experience, and you have this feeling of this presence, but it can't really be explained, it can't really be described, and that's exactly how we can talk about music in many ways as well. And so by having this understanding of music, it means that we are given a further understanding of Spirit, and by having this kind of metaphorical or allegorical form of understanding between the two of them, it can actually further us in faith, whether we're musical people or not. And that is another gift that we are given in music, and that is another way that when words fail to describe the Spirit, for example, music is able to succeed. And so, kind of going on from there, I want to talk about why music is therefore necessary for understanding how we talk about God and about faith. And I think a really, really gorgeous way of kind of summarising this is actually in a passage in Acts 16:25 to 26. Now in this section, Paul and Silas, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but they've been imprisoned, not really for doing much wrong, but that's a different sermon. They've been imprisoned, and what happens is they're imprisoned and they start singing a prayer to God. In most translations that you'll find, it actually says that they said prayers and they sang hymns to God. But actually the Greek makes it quite clear that this isn't two actions we're talking about, it's one. So the beautiful thing is they're not saying a prayer and singing a hymn, they're singing a prayerful hymn. It's all one action, it's all one thing. But the most striking thing about this passage actually is what follows after. And obviously every translation is different, but essentially what it says is that the other prisoners that were there, listened. And this is when it becomes really, really important to understand the role that music can have in our faith. Because I know for myself, at least, for those of you who don't know, I was not raised Christian. It was a choice that I made when I was 16 years old. And I know that for me, I was getting caught up in complicated theological discussions about evolution and creationism long before I was ever told simply that God loved me and that God is love. I think I only heard somebody say that when I'd kind of already decided to become a Christian for the most part. But actually something that propelled me into my faith was I saw a video online, and it's interesting. I had quite a bad perspective of Christianity when I was younger, as I think a lot of young people sadly do nowadays. And I think my perspective was basically, you know, when you're walking along and there's a street preacher and they're kind of shouting about eternal damnation and about people going to hell and about God hating people. That was basically what I thought Christianity was, sad as that is and unfortunate as that is. But I came across this video on YouTube, and it was of one of those types of street preachers. And a young group of Christians came, and they had an acoustic guitar, and they came to the kind of vicinity of this street preacher, and they started singing a song, How He Loves, by John Mark McMillan. And if you don't know, the chorus is quite simple to remember. It's How He Loves Us, basically, over and over again. So that was essentially what was going on, and slowly people started joining in because it's quite an easy song to sing, to the point where the sound of them singing How He Loves Us drowned out the hate that was coming from the mouth of this preacher, of this street preacher. And that, when I first watched it, and still when I watch it now, it moved me to tears, because I think what's so difficult for us as Christians, as people of faith, is that we try to define things, we try to use language to describe things which cannot be described, and to explain things which can hardly be explained. And we get so caught up in definitions and explanations and descriptions that it just becomes a massive complication and a confusion, and we hardly know what we're talking about anymore, let alone other people. And I know that if I was a prison, if I was a slave to sin, if I was lost and I heard a bunch of people having a theological argument, I wouldn't be listening. I wouldn't be listening at all. However, in this passage in Acts, that's not what Paul and Silas, if that's how you say his name, that's not what they do. Instead of talking about intense details of theology, they simply sing a prayerful hymn to God. And the prisoners listen. And that's the beautiful, beautiful simplicity of it, is that we don't need to have all of these complicated discussions all of the time. They have their place, of course, but they're not necessary all of the time whatsoever. And when we actually get to the root of our faith, when we get to the simple yet beautiful, emotive and heartful way of expressing our faith, which can be and is readily through music, people will listen. Because when words will fail us, when words will confuse us and complicate things, music is able to succeed. And so I kind of want to, on a finishing note, look at what that actually means for us as Christians. Because as I said earlier, not everybody is going to be a musical person. You know, you might be thinking, well, this is fantastic, however, actually, I can't play a single instrument, and I think if I tried to sing in front of people who were lost, they would probably run away. that might be what you're thinking right now. And that's kind of why I think how music can also reflect the Spirit and help us to understand the Spirit and help us to understand faith becomes more and more relevant. And I think it's beautifully said in this very simple phrase, which we can find throughout Revelation, but specifically in Revelation 14. At the beginning of Revelation 14, it's essentially talking about how at the end of time, those who have been set apart from God will join together and join with the angels to sing a new song. And that's the phrase, sing a new song. And on a literal level, if we're talking about music, I think that this is really a call for us to allow a full range of expression in music. As I spoke about before, we need to allow a full range of expression of all different emotions, all different types of music, because they're all relevant in their own different ways to different situations in worship and in different contexts. And they can all be used perfectly to honour God and to bring forth the Spirit. Because, let's face it, we're not always joyful. We can't always be singing how great is our God, when actually we're thinking, I'm really in pain and I just want a glimmer of hope. And God can give that glimmer of hope, and we can sing about that glimmer of hope if we provide the space for it to be reflected on. But in a figurative sense, it actually is really a rally call for us all as Christians to be set apart in the way that Jesus speaks about us as his disciples being set apart, in order to be a new humanity almost, in order to be truly human. There's this passage, and it's kind of repeated, this idea throughout the Bible, and anybody who knows me knows that it's an idea that I'm very attached to. I love it a lot, and it's this idea of having a softened heart, of taking the heart of stone and replacing it with a heart of flesh. And I just think it's such a gorgeous sentiment, and it's so relevant to us as Christians, because especially with what I've just been speaking about, we really need to stop overcomplicating things with all of these difficult words and phrases which can hardly be understood, especially by those who are just coming to faith. We need to just simply have a softened heart. We need to allow ourselves actually to grieve when others are grieving, and to feel pain when there is pain. My kind of metaphorical, yet also literal, I guess, way of understanding this is that we would have never had the resurrection without the crucifixion. Even in the greatest of joys, there is also a depth of pain that we have to apprehend and we have to understand as well. And I think that this is ultimately what music calls us to do. It's to have a simple yet beautiful faith. It's to have a softened heart. It's to have that heartful expression that music gifts us so readily. And we can have that not just in music, but in everyday life as well, because of the beauty of how music can reflect the Spirit too. Because, as Act says, when we sing a new song, then the prisoners will listen. Like Saul, they'll be rid of their afflictions, and just like later in that Acts reading, the prisoners will be set free.